Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hidden Histories Collective. My name is LaChris Robinson Jordan, and I'm here with another presentation as a historian and a genealogist. And thank you all so much for joining us again and being here and being present and sharing your thoughts and opinions and your knowledge, most importantly. And so this one is a really important one, as we know that free speech has been in the news a lot lately, and I don't see it going away anytime soon. But what I really wanted to do was talk about the First Amendment and what it really protects, and quite frankly, what it doesn't. And I think it's important that we move with this erudition, because if we don't, we're going to keep kind of getting sucked into these debates without having true knowledge. But I wanted to take a quick moment to explain the image that's in front of us, because I think a great deal about imagery for the channel and for very specific discussions, because I know these last forever. But I wanted this to come straight from the Hidden Histories Collective. Now, some of you may see this woman with the bandana across her mouth and think this is a symbol of silencing Black women and, or Indigenous women. And I guess for some people that could be what has been and is at play at times. But that's not the complete message that I'm saying here. In fact, it's actually quite the opposite. The image is very layered, and as a filmmaker, we tend to do that. But here I feel the need to explain it a bit. Now, the Indigenous woman that you see in front carries both the weight of silence and the strength to remove it, quite frankly. And as you see behind her, you see the Indigenous man. He's present, standing strong, supporting, and in the background, as it should be. And our ancestors are also there, reminding us that we are never alone. So this image is really about unity, men and women, the past and the present. And where one is strong, the other can be strong too. So as we talk about free speech, we know that it's not just about what the law says. It's about how we stand together in the face of silence and find our own voice. So thank you all for letting me explain this image. It was really important that I say this and it comes straight out of our mouths, because too many times people will say, well, this is what the image means and this is what we think of it. And I really want to put that on the record. Thank you so much. So again, you guys, if you have an opportunity, go to the Hidden Histories Collective website and sign up for our newsletter. We will be sending out our very first one, the first or second week of October. We're looking at putting a lot of great things in there for most people to really partake in and to internalize and enjoy. And one of the things we also do at the top of the videos is we reference other videos that we've made that are related to the subject. And if you guys have an opportunity, please go check out The U.S. Government Was Built on Indigenous Law. That's a really important one. And I'll be referencing some aspects of that video in this one, because I think it's really important to understand how everything was built, but quite frankly. So one of the things I want to do to ground us a bit is, as we talk about free speech, we're also talking about speech in general and how we communicate. And I wanted to root us in the Indigenous principles that have brought us here, to be quite frank. And one of the major principles was that we protected the family. Always. The family was always at the center and heart of everything that we did. And our speech was measured with that awareness. And so what one person said, we knew it could affect the safety and the reputation of the entire household. And some people still move that way. there isn't just one singular voice. It's a whole voice when it comes to the family. The other thing we did was we moved as a unit. The family and community voices carried more weight than an individual outburst. It carried so much more weight. When you heard one speak, you knew that it was the whole family, neighborhood, community, et cetera, and decisions in public stances reflected consensus, not isolation. So yeah, so I want us to remember these principles because sometimes I think we forget them, and social media is very, it's very alluring, and we forget that we have a foundation to adhere to at times. The other thing that we did was we honored the role of elders and leaders. And certain people were chosen to speak on behalf of the family or the community. And others supported them in unity rather than contradicting or undermining the message. So that to me is still really, really important. Whenever I have a discussion with my father, I defer to him in public because he is my father. And whatever we've talked about behind closed doors, that's what we've talked about behind closed doors. But I don't contradict him in public because I honor him as my father and as my elder. And lastly, we valued silence as much as we did speech. And as you guys know, silence is a strategy. It's a way to listen, to protect sacred knowledge, and to avoid unnecessary conflict. I think we all can agree that sometimes silence is the best weapon, right? And speaking less often will give your words more weight. It really does. So when you finally do speak, whoosh, it's powerful stuff. So I just wanted to talk about the principles, Indigenous principles for a minute, so that we remember these as we go forward and we start thinking about free speech in general. Because when we forget our principles, things can become a bit chaotic, as you can see. So let's talk about the roots of free speech. Okay. Now, many of you are probably familiar with King John. He reigned in Europe from 1199 to 1216. Now, as many of you do know, King John was very controversial, and he left a lot to be desired at times. And because of how he ruled, many people, particularly the nobles of the land, basically revolted and created what was called the Magna Carta. And they put it in writing and said, this is an English royal charter that's going to limit the power of King John by establishing that even the king is subject to the law. So it was because of his, I guess you could say, reign of terror in some regards, was why the Magna Carta became official, because they did not want to see another king like him. Not that there weren't other kings after him. There were others after him as well, and other European territories that created havoc as well. But at least in principle, the Magna Carta was created to stop the madness, at least for a moment. And yes, it was the first formal document insisting that the sovereign was as much under the rule of law as his people, and that the rights of individuals were to be upheld even against the wishes of the sovereign. And that is pretty much what we do now here in the United States. No one is above the law, right? At least that's what we say. Now, more about the roots of free speech as we move into the English Bill of Rights, which is, as many of you know, we were under British rule for a minute before, the Revolutionary War. And so, but the establishment of the English Bill of Rights established that the monarchy could not rule without consent of Parliament. So they were taking a lot of what they were practicing in England and brought it here. And that was in 1689. Now, what the English Bill of Rights did, it put in place a constitutional form of government in which the rights and liberties of the individual were protected under English law. So as you could see there was a pattern here of protections, at least in on paper. So when we move to what we now know to be the foundation of U.S. governance, now here's where it gets really interesting. Many of the colonists observed the Indigenous and used what they saw as a foundation for establishing what we now know to be the United States of America. And so the founding fathers didn't necessarily invent the systems we see today, but they just borrowed them. So even though in practice, England had their Bill of Rights, they had their Magna Carta, they were still very much about what we did as Indigenous people that they had not implemented, or at least not in practice for as long as we did. Because, talking about the timeline and the age of America, America is not, 200 years old. It is much older than that. So I want to stress that too, because people tend to say, oh, well, we're only 238 years old. But in terms of the Indigenous way of life, we are centuries years old. And so the founding fathers, quote unquote, were looking at centuries of governance as opposed to what they had brought over from England. So now let's talk about the path to the First Amendment. And to me, this is really, really important because so many people in this country, and this is probably due to the fact that, you take civics classes and then you forget about them. You haven't been in high school or junior high school forever. And so you forget about the history of the Constitution and how it was structured. And so I think it's so important that we understand the constitutional history as well as constitutional law as much as we can, because if you don't understand the history of how the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution came to be, you'll be talking in a vacuum often. So let's talk about that. So before there was the Constitution, it was the Articles of Confederation, which were adopted on November 15th, 1777, and then went to the states for approval. So the articles went into effect on March 1st, 1781, to be exact. Because remember, it wasn't just about saying, hey, we're going to write these articles. It still had to be approved by the colonies or the states. And central government, and the reason why they put together the Articles of Confederation was because there was really nothing really binding the colonies together, so they had to have something in place. But even with the Articles of Confederation, the central government had very limited power. They couldn't tax, they couldn't regulate trade, and they couldn't enforce the laws very strongly because there's such a hodgepodge of governmental activity in the United States. And so they quickly learned that they need something stronger and more powerful to keep the states in line, if you will. So in 1787, we have the U.S. Constitution, and it is signed September 17th, 1787 in Philadelphia. Now, at this time, there were no free speech protections that were included in the original Constitution. There were none yet. It was just the Constitution, here we go, and this is what we have. So in 1789, after long, lengthy debates, James Madison was just one of the men that introduced constitutional amendments in the first Congress. So you've got Articles of Confederation, you have a U.S. Constitution, and now you have amendments that need to be added and adhered to allow more protections for citizens. Now, in 1791, the First Amendment was ratified as part of the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is literally the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. So when you hear people talk about the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, know that the Bill of Rights is actually the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And then amendments 11 through 27 came later, one at a time, as the Constitution evolved. So 11 through 27 was not part of the Bill of Rights. Okay. And so when you talk about the Reconstruction amendments in particular, and, when you talk about the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship, those came after slavery, and it was really specific to the time in history. So one of the things that most people must do when they study the Constitution or look at the amendments, look at when the amendment was passed and understand the history and the reasons why that amendment was passed. So when we talk about the 14th Amendment, for example, and we talk about birthright citizenship, well, that wasn't added to the Constitution until 1868. And it was not part of the Bill of Rights. It was literally a Reconstruction amendment to focus on, or I guess you could say, to quote unquote fix the issues around slavery. So I'm also going to create or put a link in the description for the birthright citizenship video that I did, because I think that's really, really important for people to know and understand, particularly as the birthright citizenship, discussion continues to get heated up, and that's going to be pretty heady here coming up pretty soon. But I just wanted you guys to kind of understand how certain amendments came along and at what time, so you can get the history of the Constitution and not just see it as one document that was written all at once. It wasn't. So now, again, the U.S. Constitution, I'm including this graphic here so you can see how we came to what we know to be the First Amendment. So it was a mix of colonists like Madison, Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin observing the systems of liberty and accountability among the nations, specifically the Iroquois Confederacy. And so the U.S. Constitution was heavily influenced by them. And you see all the roots of what we now know to be the U.S. Constitution. And I want to say this too, just to reiterate this point. In 1988, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution acknowledging the influence of the Iroquois Confederacy on the development of the U.S. Constitution. And this resolution also reaffirmed the government-to-government relationship between the U.S. and Indian tribes. So for those people who have any doubts about the influence of the Indigenous on the Constitution, this resolution at least is on the record to say, yes, we were heavily influenced. The Constitution was heavily influenced by the American Indians. So now let's talk about the First Amendment now that we've gotten onto the path of it. So the exact text of the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So that's the exact wording of the First Amendment. So you have freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of people to protest and peaceably assemble, so on and so on. Now, historically, the reason for the free speech clause in particular came from colonial mistrust of government power. Now, remember, again, these colonists had come from England. They had seen what had happened to them before. And even though there was a Bill of Rights and all of these different things in place, they still didn't trust the government because they had to fight the British, right? So they still did not trust government. That is why they had to, at least they felt they had to continue putting certain dynamics in place to make sure that they didn't have more conflict. So again, just reiterating that in 1791, the Bill of Rights cemented protections for citizens when it came to federal censorship. They did not want to have an issue where they could not speak out against the government at all. So now remember, even though you had an amendment and you had the Constitution, it still took 2 centuries of court battles to define what is and what isn't protected. So it has taken a long time for us to get to this space of saying, okay, this is okay to talk about. This may not be so cool to talk about. There's been a lot of court cases that have come down the pipe. And I'll just say that in general, when you think about governance, it's a very, very lengthy process. And, I don't want to say perfect it, but yes, to find a way to at least find balance is incredible. And I guess you can say the history never ends. And we'll probably still have more coming up as we move here. Now, I want to talk about what is allowed. I think a lot of people say freedom of speech, but they have to know, at least from a legal perspective, what is considered to be free speech by the U.S. government and what you can say. Now, political speech is fine, government criticism, satire and comedy, peaceful protest and demonstrations, symbolic acts such as flag burning, offensive or unpopular opinions, student expression within limits, and you also have the right to not speak at all. And that means that, you don't necessarily have to salute the flag. You don't have to pledge allegiance. And there are some religious groups that don't. Primarily the Jehovah's Witnesses, they will not pledge allegiance to the flag and put their hands over their hearts. It's against their religion. So all of that is allowed. Now, what gets really tricky is people are still being laid off, suspended, and fired from their jobs. But we're going to get into that in a little bit. But I just wanted to show you the list of what is allowed in terms of freedom of speech. Now, there's a lot that is not allowed as well. And this is where sometimes there are some gray areas, but this specifically is what you cannot use as a defense of free speech. You cannot use speech to promote imminent lawless action. And I've put all of the Supreme Court cases for you to reference. I don't want to explain every single one. I just want to give you guys, a cursory view of what these Supreme Court cases are. You can also not use speech as fighting words or face-to-face insults likely to provoke immediate violence. So that means you can't get in somebody's face and say, I'm going to, kick your butt. Those are fighting words. And you can be held liable for that because now you're in someone's face and you're provoking immediate violence, not just with your physicality, but with your words. You also can't make or distribute obscene materials. You just can't do it. Roth versus United States. And students in particular cannot make an obscene speech at a school-sponsored event. These are just some of the cases for folks to reference. And again, I could be here for a whole hour to 2 hours talking about these cases individually, but this is where it's important to note what is allowed and what is not. So now here is where things get interesting and where most people, I've been seeing so much of this, where most people are getting it wrong. Now, private organizations. Now, the First Amendment text is clear. Congress shall make no law. And this restrains the government, but not private organizations. Not private organizations. I'll tell you why. Most people will say, but I have free speech. Now that's legally true. You do. The government can't arrest you for most speech. However, your employer isn't the government. Your employer is a private organization. And most companies are protecting their brands, clients, and workplace harmony. And certain types of employee speech can threaten those. So you must understand that when it comes to your employer, it doesn't matter how you feel about speech. It is what is either in the policy or in your employee handbook. Now, public employees, whether if you work for a government agency, including local, state, and federal, even a public university, now they are bound, the public employers are bound by the Constitution to give free speech protections. However, public employees can still face discipline if their speech disrupts the workplace, undermines their job duties, or violates professional standards. For example, the teacher posting violent content about students. And as you guys know, many people across the public sector also were laid off recently, from teachers to firefighters, police officers, even people in the military were called on the carpet. So just because you're a public employee, it doesn't mean that you can say what you want to say. Now back to private employees. Again, for corporations, businesses, nonprofits, they're not bound by the First Amendment. It's more about contract or workplace rules. So that's why it's so important for people to know their employee handbook left and right. Know the contracts that you're signing with employers, because they have all kinds of policies now, and they've even added social media policies. That is why a lot of people lost their jobs, because they violated their contracts and they violated workplace rules. And so you can get fired for that. You can get fired for violating internal policy. And I know that it sucks for many people, but again, that's why, that's why in many ways I decided to get into paralegal studies and really understand the law, because, it's not about emotions anymore. It's really about the law and what you can and can't do, and how you protect yourself and your family and your loved ones and your livelihood. That's really what it's about. And it's so tempting to just get emotional, grab your phone, get on your laptop, and start posting how you feel. And what happened to a lot of people recently it wasn't just that they had posted, negative comments on social media. It was that some of those social media posts were screenshot, and they were doxxed by not just their friends, but also people who didn't even know them. And social media is very, very alluring, like I said earlier. And it's tempting to think that you can say whatever you want. But remember, you also have a contract with a social media platform. Whenever you hit that consent button, say, yes, I consent to all of these different things, you're consenting to follow and abide by their rules as well. So even on social media, you have to adhere to their platform's rules and regulations. So it's so important to know this, because you could be banned from certain platforms as well. It isn't just your employer firing you or suspending you. It could be that platform saying, no, this is not it's not cool with us. So I also want to say this. I want to talk a little bit about online activity. And there's a lot of free speech videos out there. And I think it's important that this is said, that remember this, guys, the online activity on all of your devices, from your phone, tablets, watches, all of that. They're not toys. They're not toys. Many of these devices are military grade, are built from the same technology. And what I mean by that is that by the time we get this technology, it's already 50 years old. The military has already been using it, and they have advanced forms of technology. Don't let anybody tell you different. So even if you post something that's risky, you have to assume that someone can and will find a way to tie it to you. You just have to know this. I don't care how anonymous you think you are. I don't care how, obscure your username is. You're still traceable. That is what the internet was meant to do. That was the biggest feature, was to trace you, to trace the movement of enemies, foreign and domestic. Just be really honest with you. So even when you think that you have an alias, it can still be traced back to you. So I want everyone to remember that you pay special attention to how the technology works. And I'm also going to say this too. This is the publicist in me. Before I moved over to law and history, I was a publicist up until recently. And, a lot of my clients were very high profile. And so my role was to make sure that their reputations remained intact. And so most of my clients, I'd say all of them, were really careful of what they said and what they posted and how they presented themselves. And I would say you don't have to be a celebrity. You don't have to be a public figure to move like one. And I will pose this question. If you had a team of people behind you, you had an attorney, a publicist, an accountant, and all of that, how would you move? You would still consult your team before you posted anything. You wouldn't just post it and say, hey, I'm going to do this, unless you knew that you were going to stand by what you said 100% and were willing to take the risk of what that meant. So this is not to necessarily discourage anyone from using their voice. You must use your voice. This is what we do on the Hidden Histories Collective. We're using our voice, but you have to use it responsibly. So just had to say that. Just had to put that out there. I want to say this before we close out the presentation today. I think it's really important to say this. As Indigenous people, we've always known that words are not free. We've always known this. They carry responsibility. They can heal or they can harm. From the beginning, we protected our families. We spoke with unity, and we knew when silence was the wiser path. Yes, the First Amendment gives us the right to speak, but our traditions remind us that freedom is never just about the right. It's about how we use it. And as we face the future of speech in this digital age, let us carry both the protection of our ancestors and the wisdom to speak with purpose, dignity, and care. So thank you all so much for joining us on the Hidden Histories Collective. We appreciate your comments, your likes, your shares, and just your energy. And that keeps us going so much. We'll be talking to you soon.